Shalom and welcome to the Heartland Connection. This is Zach Waller, the Executive Director of Hayovel, your host, coming to you guys straight from the Heartland of Israel. The summer trip ended last week. It was an amazing trip. The 3 weeks of having the guys here volunteering, do all kinds of stuff. I don't know, it just seems like every trip just keeps getting better and better. Like, it's just amazing to see people connecting to the land, people coming back for the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth time, and just taking it to another level. Learning more, connecting more, and just the experience, it's different than, any other educational way of, sitting in a classroom or studying when you can actually touch it and feel it. It's just an incredible thing. So it's always encouraging, inspiring to see people connecting on the different trips. So the summer trip was awesome. Finished that up last week. And now we're just in a really intense prep time for harvest, because harvest is starting next week. And we've got over 100 people coming in for this year's harvest season, starting next week and going through October. So we're really gearing up, getting things fixed up around here, getting cots put together, getting bedrooms fixed up, all that kind of good stuff. So lots going on around here in prep for that. So that's really exciting. Everything looks like it's coming together really well. It's another thing we are always growing in every year, just the volunteer experience, and making sure that their accommodations are good. And like every year just gets better and better. So thank God He is providing more and more of a place for the nations to come here to the land of Israel and connect. Last week I mentioned that we were just under 10,000 listens on the Heartland Connection podcast, from this last year. And I mentioned that it would be great if we could get over 10,000, but I mentioned that it was like 9,600, something like that, so we have to get like 400 listens, but I didn't take into account that that people would listen to the older podcasts too. So actually we went way over 10,000. It was like 10,200 and something listens that we got on the first year of the Heartland Connection podcast. So that was really exciting for me and inspiring that people are listening and being encouraged. So thank you guys for listening and for sharing and for getting the word out and this helping people get connected to the Heartland of Israel. So this week's Torah portion is Re'eh, or see, and we're in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 26 through chapter 16, verse 17. So starting right here in chapter 11, verse 26, it says, see, I present a blessing and a curse. And it's interesting that it uses the word see, and there's quite a few different ideas about why it says see, because you'd think, if you're presenting a blessing and a curse, it would be something that you would, that you're hearing, he's talking, right? But it says see, like visualize this thing. And then it's really cool because it goes on to say, we're actually going to do this whole thing. This is actually not just going to be me talking. This is actually going to be a whole ceremony that you guys are going to do when you go into the land of Israel. And it's going to happen on the Mount of Gerizim and the Mount of Ebal, the Mount of blessing and the Mount of cursing. Over this mountain, we're going to place the blessing. This mountain, we're going to set the curse. And as we bring people to these locations, because it's really amazing, our base in Israel is actually situated on the Mount of Blessing, on Mount Gerizim. So that's very, very special for us. And so we get to take people around here and show them around and dig into these scriptures a lot. And one thing we like to always remind people is that there's not a mountain that's cursed in Israel. So a lot of people hear, oh, this is the Mount of Blessing, that's the Mount of Cursing. Oh, well, that's that. No wonder that mountain looks so rocky and barren. It's the Mount of Cursing. But there's no place in Israel that's cursed. But there was these two mountains set aside as a place to speak forth. Okay, if you walk in obedience to the commandments, you will receive a blessing. And if you don't, you will receive a cursing. So it's just like a visual reminder of, okay, I always need to follow the blessing, to be obedient. And the really interesting thing is, we see in this passage, when this event actually happens in Joshua chapter 8. It says that Joshua goes and builds an altar. And does he build it on the Mount of Blessing? No, he actually builds this altar on Mount Ebal, on the Mount of Cursing. And so there's a lot of things you could get from that. But one of the things that we've taught and thought of here is that it kind of shows that even in the cursing, even in the disobedience, even if you walk away from the blessing of God's commandments, there's always a way back. There's always a way. And this altar is kind of a symbolism of being able to come back to God and worship Him. And so there's always a way back through to worship God and to connect to Him through the sacrifice. Which is a really interesting thing, actually. This altar that was made on Mount Ebal is actually a very interesting recent finding. Relatively recent. In 1980, there was a couple archaeologists that got together and said, you know what, we need to do a systematic, archaeological research through Judea and Samaria, because, in 1967, they had just gotten this area back, and this is, the heartland of Israel. There's so much that happened right in this area. They're like, you know what, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, with when the next war might be, how long we'll be able to hold on to this territory. So we need to get out there and do a systematic, archaeological search, a dig, and find out what all's here and what we can still find in today's time. And so in 1980, a atheist, actually, archaeologist named Adam Zartal actually went to this area, and he was just searching for whatever he could find. He was an atheist, doesn't necessarily, doesn't believe in the Bible, doesn't believe in its relevancy, but he's like, okay, I'm just an archaeologist, I like to find things, whatever. He's out searching, and all of a sudden he uncovers this rock formation. He's like, what could this be? It's on Mount Ebal. He starts digging around, uncovering it, and he's like, looks like some sort of ancient fortress or house, but it's kind of filled in. It's kind of an odd shape. So he kind of maps it out on a piece of paper, takes it back to a community nearby, Shaveh Shomron, and he's like showing it to a couple of the people around. And actually, no, a student, a yeshiva student there, actually just looked over his shoulder and saw this drawing and was like, hey, that's an altar. And he's like, an altar? And he's like, yeah, it's an altar. For sure that's an altar. And he said, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. He said, look. And he pulled out one of his study books from ancient sources, from the ancient sages of Israel, and he showed that he had a picture, a perfectly drawn out picture of the altar. Looked exactly like what Adam Zartal had found. And so he was like, okay, this is crazy. So he goes back and digs it out, uncovers it more, and sure enough finds, yeah, this is definitely an altar. And it dates back right to the time of when the Israelites would have come in to the land of Israel. And so after doing some more tests, and they took the ashes, there were ashes around this altar, they took the ashes, did tests on them, they found out that they were all kosher animals, and that they were all from the bones of animals that were under 1 year old, which was the specifications for making a sacrifice, an offering on this altar. And there were also bones outside, just off to the side of the altar, that weren't burnt. So that would indicate that there was some sort of feast that happened there. That there was actually people that were eating meat, and also clean animals. And also the altar was made out of all whole uncut stones. So every part of this altar pointed back to this being an Israelite altar, and being in this location, and dated back to this time frame. They said this has to be Joshua's altar. So it's a really incredible thing to actually, we've taken groups up there and actually seen it, and a huge verification and proof that God's word is true, and that these biblical accounts that we see happening throughout the Bible are real and true, and we can go back and prove them through archaeology. So this atheist guy actually became a believer after this. He was believed in God, and that the Bible was true after that. So it's a very, very, very powerful, amazing story. So carrying on in the Torah portion in chapter 12, verse 1, it's really interesting. It talks about the land. And I think this is something that we really need to connect to, especially for those of you guys that are outside of the land of Israel and wanting to connect, wanting to study, wanting to connect to the land of Israel, is to notice where it mentions the land. So here in chapter 12, verse 1, it says, "These are the decrees and the ordinances that you shall observe to perform in the land that Hashem, the God of your forefathers, has given you to possess it all the days that you live on the land." So we see that this is a very important thing. God didn't just say, "Yeah, go in and do this." He says, "In the land." When you come into the land, this is when you're going to observe these commandments. There's a special connection to the land. We just talked about Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal, of the children of Israel coming in, and there was a special connection to the land. They experienced these things. They call that the whole ceremony that happened in Joshua 8 it's like the wedding ceremony that took place when the children of Israel married the land, when they connected to the land and made covenant, said, "Yes, we will, abide by these rules and accept the blessings and the cursings." It's like their marriage contract to the land. So this is a very, very powerful thing. And so there's something to this land thing. There's a reason why God says when you come into the land, there's a special connection here, a special place of keeping the commandments and following after them. And I think it's something that we really need to pay attention to when we're studying from outside of the land, when these things are said. And kind of along that same line, in chapter 12, verse 5, we see here, after God's talking about driving out the nations and destroying the places of worship that the nations that lived there prior to the Israelites worshipped at, destroying those things, cutting down the sacred pillars, all these things. And then it says in verse 5, "Rather, only at the place that Hashem your God will choose from among all your tribes to place his name there. There shall you seek out his presence and come there. And there shall you bring your burnt offerings and feast offerings, your tithes, and what you raise up with your hand, your vow offerings, your freewill offerings, etc." And so we see, again, this pointing back to the actual land, a particular place, a place that God would choose. And it's interesting, in this Torah portion, it's repeated in verse 14, verse 18, the place that he will choose. I think for us American, Western culture, it's hard for us sometimes to let somebody else choose. It's hard for us to not be in control, to not decide, what, I'm the one who's in control of this. I'm the one who decides. But no, in this thing, God himself chose. And we have to align ourselves with his choosing. We have to decide, what, we are going to be okay with that. If God chose the land of Israel, the physical land of Israel, then we agree with God's choosing. If God chose the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, then we are going to be okay with God's choosing. It's the place that he will choose. And we see that as being Jerusalem. First it was Shiloh, right? It was Shiloh, where the tabernacle rested for 369 years. A lot of people don't realize that the tabernacle was actually in Shiloh for 369 years. That's a long time. And then was moved up to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount. So I just want to really emphasize that we have to pay attention and align ourselves with God's choosing. Dad likes to talk about this idea of choosing as being a very special thing. And he talked about how Dad was at a wedding, and a Jewish wedding, and there was and the Jewish father who was his daughter was getting married. He said, "What? I never really understood the power of choosing." And he said, "I never thought that anybody could love my daughter more than me. It's my daughter, it's my precious treasure that God has given to me. I didn't think anybody else could love her more. But the reality is God gave her to me. I wasn't really my choice. He gave me this daughter. But for my daughter's husband now, he is choosing her. He could choose anybody else. this daughter was, the father was saying, this daughter was given to me by birth. It was given to me, but this husband now is choosing her out of all the other girls everywhere, out of all the other women in the world. He is choosing her, and now because of that, he can go a whole nother step further in his relationship, in being close and loving this woman, this guy's daughter, even more than her own father. And so Israel's kind of like that to God. God chose Israel out of all the nations of the world. God chose Israel, and specifically chose her in order to bring His light into the rest of the world. But there's a power, something very special about God's choosing, and something that we need to connect to. As we've been here for the last 13 years now, as we've tried to take this message back out to the nations, there's been some pushback. Some people are offended by that. How come God chose Israel? What about all the other nations of the world? God created the whole world. What's so special about Israel? Well, we've come to find that God chose Israel for a specific role, a specific purpose, something that He wants to do with Israel in bringing His salvation to the world. So basically, Israel is the theater. Israel is the platform that God's using to bring salvation to the world. That's why God is so infatuated and in love with Israel, wants to see Israel rise and thrive and be a torch, that's burning, that spreads light to the rest of the world. It's His choosing. And His choosing is not just some sort of spiritual, because a lot of time in Christian circles, we tend to spiritualize everything. Everything's woo-hooey, I like to say, up in the clouds. But no, this is a real physical thing, a physical land, a physical people that God is using, that God has chosen. Let's see, we have in chapter 12, verse 15, this, a lot of you guys get into this. It says, you eat meat, all that you desire. So, we can jump in there and have as much meat as we want. Chapter 13, verse 2 talks about a false prophet. You have to beware of somebody who comes in and tries to lead you away from God's ways. And even if a whole city is taken away, they have to be, smitten, and they have to be taken out. Chapter 14, we go through the kosher animals. And in verse 21, it talks about, it's a very mysterious verse. It says not to cook a kid in its mother's milk. Most of you guys are aware that the Jewish people take this verse, and it's actually repeated, and they take this to mean that you're not supposed to eat meat and dairy products together. And they take it, to very, very far. They say you can't even eat meat and dairy on the same plates. You have to have two different sinks to wash these two different things in. And they really are very, very particular about making sure to keep this commandment and honor God with this. I've heard a lot of people say, okay, so how in the world do you not cook a kid in its mother's milk and turn that into not eating meat and dairy together? This really doesn't seem to add up. If you break down the Hebrew on this, kid actually could mean, doesn't just mean a baby goat, it could mean any young animal, from what I understand. And basically, I don't have time to really go into this too in depth, but basically, they say that this is an idiom saying that you shouldn't cook meat in milk. And what's really one fascinating thing about this that I will share is that the Samaritans, there's actually a group of people called the Samaritans who live here in Israel, and they would find any way that they could to be different than the Jewish people, but they actually believe in the same thing, that they're not supposed to eat meat and milk together, which is kind of proof that this is a Middle Eastern idiom that's used here that they would understand. So I'll throw that much out there for now. You guys jump in there and study. It's a very interesting study. In verse 15, we have the Shemitah mentioned. I think as I was thinking about this verse, the thought hit me because it talks about basically giving authority of land back to the original owners, right? That's this whole thing, is that every 7 years you have this time of release, the Shemitah, and there's this time of giving back to the original owners, setting is like a reset, right thing. And I thought, you know what? I wonder if there's a connection here between us giving respect and authority back to the Jewish people. You know, they're the ones who God chose. They're the ones who He has been given the oracles of God. You know, the keepers of His word. I think it says even in the New Testament in Romans chapter 3 talks about how the Jewish people have been given this task, and that now I believe that for all of us who believe in God, we need to give them back now that they're back in the land. Now that God is using them for a very specific, amazing purpose of rebuilding the land and settling here and bringing about this in the beginning this redemption process. I think it's time for us to recognize God's choosing and give the Jewish people back the authority and respect that they deserve as God's chosen people. And I've heard a lot of people on the Shemitah topic, they're what I would feel like are very misguided and uneducated teachers who would take this whole Shemitah thing as something that applies outside of Israel, as something that, and there's been taken a lot of different directions. But I think we need to dial this back in to being applicable to the land of Israel and the Jewish people, the physical people of Israel, the physical land of Israel, and also give the authority back to the Jewish people, and the respect, really, the main thing. Respecting the Jewish people as God's chosen people, the people of His choosing, and discontinue the arrogant, anti-Semitic fight and attitude, and arrogance that has been held in Jewish circles, Christian circles, against the Jewish people. In chapter 16, we go through the feast, and this is such an amazing scripture. It talks about rejoicing in the feast. You know, it's such an amazing thing that God would command that you have to have a feast, and you have to gather all together, right? He said, everybody join up in Jerusalem, and you have to take food, and you have to rejoice. You're thinking about, some people look at the God of the Old Testament as like some sort of, very somber, serious person who demands, sacrifices and like all this, really strange picture of God. But no, God is like, you have to rejoice, you have to celebrate, you have to get together with people, you have to, meet with me, and in my presence is fullness of joy. And I love in verse 15, it says you have to be completely joyous, like you have to go out of your way to be so happy. And then wrapping up the portion here in verse 16, it says to go up to Jerusalem. There's this time where you're commanded 3 times a year to make this pilgrimage up to Jerusalem. And what's really interesting about this is that in Zechariah chapter 14, it talks about the nations coming up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. And so this commandment specifically says that there's a connection with the nations coming up. And we know the scriptures in Isaiah that talk about the temple being a house of prayer for all nations. So there's this connection here with the feast and the nations coming together to worship God on His holy mountain. In Isaiah chapter 56, it talks about, starting in verse 3, it says, "Let not the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from His people." It's like, no, God's going to join you. And then it talks about everyone who keeps Shabbat, right? A lot of us are trying to press in and say, okay, what is the Shabbat? How do we keep this? What's our role in this whole thing? And then it says, who hold fast my covenant. People who are recognizing the covenant made with Abraham. And it says in verse 7, "These I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer." So that's it for this week. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you can share this around, that would be great. Spread the word. And Shabbat Shalom from the beautiful, exceedingly good land of Israel.
Restoration.